The morning of August 1st, 1943, Benghazi, Libya, Captain Robert Sternfels stood beside his B-24 Liberator, watching the dust kicked up by 177 bombers preparing for takeoff. The heat already shimmered off the desert floor at 5 in the morning. His aircraft, nicknamed the Sandman, carried enough fuel and bombs to reach targets 1,400 miles away, deeper into enemy territory than any bomber had struck before. The mission was Operation Tidal Wave. The target, Ploiești, Romania, Hitler's gas station. The refineries there produced over 8.5 million tons of oil per year, roughly 1/3 of all Axis fuel. American planners believed destroying Ploiești could shorten the war by 6 months, but there was a problem the Germans didn't yet understand. They had calculated that Allied bombers lacked the range to reach Romania from North African bases carrying meaningful bomb loads. Their intelligence was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. As Sternfels climbed into his pilot's seat, he knew what his B-24 carried: 8,000 pounds of high-explosive and incendiary bombs packed into the twin bomb bays, 3,614 gallons of fuel filling every tank, including special bomb bay tanks installed for this mission. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had been designed around a revolutionary concept: deliver heavy payloads across distances, previously thought impossible for aircraft of its size and weight. German intelligence officers in Romania had assessed Allied bomber capabilities based on their own aircraft limitations. The Luftwaffe's longest-range bomber, the problematic Heinkel He-177, could barely manage similar distances with far smaller payloads. Their medium bombers, the workhorses of the German Air Force, had ranges measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. The idea that American heavy bombers could carry 4 tons of bombs 1,700 miles seemed physically impossible. The Germans prepared defences at Ploiești, expecting harassment raids at most, not a massive low-altitude assault by 177 4-engine bombers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Colonel Alfred Gerstenberg commanded Ploiești's defences. He had seen intelligence reports about American B-24 capabilities, but like many Luftwaffe officers, he dismissed them as Allied exaggeration. The numbers simply didn't add up. How could an aircraft weighing 65,000 pounds at takeoff, nearly 30 tons, fly over 1,000 miles, drop massive bomb loads, and return home? The fuel consumption alone should make such missions impossible. German bombers required elaborate relay systems and forward bases to strike targets half that distance. What Gerstenberg and his intelligence officers failed to grasp was American engineering philosophy. While German aircraft designers prioritized dive bombing capability and tactical flexibility, American engineers had focused obsessively on a single question: how do we carry the most bombs the farthest distance? The answer lay in the B-24's distinctive Davis wing, a high aspect ratio design that produced exceptional lift-to-drag ratios. That unusual wing, mounted high on the fuselage, gave the Liberator range that defied conventional aeronautical expectations. As Sternfels powered up his 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, he thought about the journey ahead. 2 hours over the Mediterranean, 2 hours over the Balkans, then the target run at wavetop height to avoid radar detection, then the long flight home, if they survived. The mission profile was audacious because the aircraft made it possible. The B-24 Liberator was about to demonstrate a capability that would fundamentally change German strategic calculations for the rest of the war. To understand why the Luftwaffe so dramatically underestimated Allied bomber capabilities, we must examine the philosophical divide that separated German and American air power doctrine in 1943. The Luftwaffe had been conceived in the mid-1930s as a tactical air force designed to support ground operations. This wasn't an accident but deliberate policy rooted in Germany's strategic position. As a continental power expecting to fight on multiple fronts, Germany needed aircraft that could provide close air support, conduct battlefield interdiction, and destroy tactical targets. The devastating success of Stuka dive bombers in Poland and France reinforced this doctrine. German bomber development reflected these priorities. When Luftwaffe planners designed heavy bombers, they imposed requirements that American engineers would have considered contradictory. The He-177, for instance, was required to perform moderate-angle dive bombing while also serving as a long-range strategic bomber. This dual-role requirement produced a troubled aircraft plagued by engine fires. Its coupled engines earned it the nickname Reichsleiter among German crews. More fundamentally, the tactical focus meant German bombers rarely operated beyond 500 miles from their bases. German intelligence organizations reflected and reinforced these limitations. The Luftwaffe's intelligence service, subordinated to operations staff rather than functioning as an independent entity, consistently underestimated enemy capabilities. This wasn't merely incompetence, it was structural. Intelligence officers who delivered assessments contradicting operational assumptions faced career consequences. Major Josef Beppo Schmid, head of Luftwaffe intelligence, had earned a reputation for tailoring reports to please Hermann Göring rather than describing reality. This pattern of wishful assessment had already failed catastrophically during places. The Battle of Britain. Schmidt's Study Blue report, compiled from a London bookshop purchase and newspaper clippings, underestimated RAF fighter production by 200%. Throughout late 1940, German intelligence insisted the RAF was down to its last 150 fighters, even as British factories produced 450 fighters per month. The same institutional blindness now affected assessments of American bomber capabilities. American strategic thinking followed a completely different path. As an island nation protected by oceans, the United States had embraced strategic bombing doctrine early. The Army Air Corps, later the Army Air Forces, developed around the conviction that wars could be won by destroying enemy industrial capacity from the air. This doctrine demanded bombers with unprecedented range and payload capacity. The B-24 Liberator emerged from this philosophy. In January 1939, General Henry Hap Arnold challenged Consolidated Aircraft to design a bomber superior to the Psipsen Flying Fortress. The specification demanded a bomber capable of 300 miles per hour, 3,000 miles range, and 35,000 feet ceiling. David R. Davis, Consolidated's chief engineer, proposed a revolutionary wing design based on laminar flow principles not yet fully understood by aeronautical science. The Davis wing was long, narrow, and unusually thick, optimized purely for efficiency at the expense of maneuverability. The result was an aircraft that looked ungainly compared to the sleek Psipsen. The B-24's slab-sided fuselage earned it the nickname Flying Boxcar. Its high-mounted wing made it difficult to fly in close formation. But that wing delivered extraordinary range. With standard fuel capacity of 2364 gallons, a B-24 could fly 1,700 miles, carrying 5,000 pounds of bombs. With bomb bay fuel tanks increasing capacity to 3614 gallons, range extended to 2,400 miles distances. German planners considered impossible for heavy bombers. By mid-1943, American industry was producing B-24 Sekunda at staggering rates. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan employed mass production techniques Henry Ford had pioneered with automobiles. At peak production, the mile-long assembly line produced one complete B-24 every 51 minutes. Over 18,000 Liberators would be built before war's end, more than any other American combat aircraft. The Luftwaffe's failure to understand B-24 capabilities wasn't simply about underestimating a single aircraft. It reflected systematic intelligence failures rooted in organizational culture and strategic assumptions that had hardened into dogma. German bomber doctrine emphasized what could be called the radius of action, the distance an aircraft could fly to a target, conduct operations, and return to base. This calculation necessarily included fuel reserves for combat maneuvering, weather contingencies, and navigation errors. For German medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 or Junkers Ju-88, operational radius rarely exceeded 400 miles. Even planning documents for the problematic He-177 strategic bomber assumed operational radiuses of 600 to 700 miles at most. When German intelligence officers received reports of American bombers striking targets over 1,000 miles from their bases, they applied their own operational frameworks to the data. The numbers appeared impossible. An aircraft carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs, equivalent to the entire bomb capacity of two He-111s, should consume fuel at rates, making such ranges unattainable. The reports must be exaggerations, they concluded, or the actual bomb loads must be far smaller than claimed. This analytical failure stemmed from several compounding errors. First, German intelligence consistently underestimated American industrial capacity and technological sophistication. The United States was viewed as a nation good at mass production, but lacking engineering finesse. The idea that American designers had solved aerodynamic problems that stymied German engineers contradicted this comfortable assumption. Second, Luftwaffe officers projected their own resource constraints onto the enemy. By 1943, Germany faced severe fuel shortages. Every gallon of aviation gasoline was precious. German bomber operations were increasingly constrained by fuel availability rather than aircraft numbers. Surely, German planners reasoned, the Allies faced similar limitations. The concept of American bombers flying 1,000-mile missions with fuel tanks containing over 3,000 gallons seemed profligate beyond belief. Third, the Luftwaffe's organizational structure prevented effective intelligence gathering and analysis. Intelligence officers held low status within the command structure. They were considered, in one assessment, maids of all work, whose duties included troop welfare and propaganda. Intelligence organizations existed only at the highest command levels. No intelligence officers were assigned below corps level until 1944. This meant frontline experiences and observations rarely reached analytical units that might have corrected erroneous assumptions. The cost of these miscalculations became apparent in August 1943. Colonel Gerstenberg had prepared elaborate defences at Ploesti based on expectations of limited raids by smaller forces. He deployed anti-aircraft batteries, barrage balloons, and smoke generators. He positioned German, Romanian, and Bulgarian fighters for quick response. But his defensive planning assumed American bombers, if they reached Ploesti at all, would arrive at high altitude with reduced bomb loads after an exhausting flight from distant bases. Instead, 177 B-24 Sekunde appeared over Ploesti at wavetop height, each, carrying 4 tons of bombs after flying nearly 1,200 miles from Benghazi. The low-altitude attack profile enabled by the B-24's range, allowing the circuitous route through Albania and Yugoslavia to approach from an unexpected direction, caught defences completely unprepared for the weight of that ordnance delivered. The Ploesti raid proved devastating not just for the physical damage inflicted, but for the psychological impact on German strategic planning. If American bombers could reach Romania from North Africa, what targets in Germany itself were now vulnerable? The comfortable assumption that geography provided defensive depth evaporated. German fighter and flak resources, already stretched thin between the Eastern Front and homeland defense, would need massive reallocation. The B-24 Liberator hadn't just exceeded Luftwaffe expectations, it had shattered the fundamental assumptions underlying German air defense strategy. And this was only the beginning of what Allied strategic bombing would accomplish. To understand why the B-24 Liberator represented such a quantum leap in bomber capability, we must examine the specific engineering solutions that made its performance possible. The aircraft that arrived over Ploesti on August 1, 1943, was predominantly the B-24D model, the first mass-produced variant considered combat-ready by the United States Army Air Forces. The B-24D had a wingspan of 110 feet and measured 67 feet 2 inches in length. Empty, it weighed 38,000 pounds. At maximum takeoff weight, it could reach 71,000 pounds over 35 tons. 4 Pratt and Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower with turbo superchargers, powered the aircraft. Maximum speed reached 290 miles per hour at altitude, with a cruising speed of 215 miles per hour. The key to the B-24's extraordinary range lay in its fuel, capacity and aerodynamic efficiency. Standard internal fuel tanks held 23 64 gallons. For long-range missions, auxiliary tanks in the bomb bay increased capacity to 36 14 gallons, nearly 14,000 litres of high-octane aviation gasoline. The Davis Wing's laminar flow design produced a lift-to-drag ratio superior to any contemporary heavy bomber. While the B-24 Flying Fortress could manage 1,600 miles with a 5,000-pound bomb load, the B-24 achieved 1,700 miles with the same payload at an all-up weight of 61,500 pounds. The bomb bay design represented another revolutionary feature: twin compartments, each capable of holding 8,000 pounds of ordnance, could accommodate various bomb configurations. For the Plosti mission, most B-24 Sekunda carried mixed loads, 500-pound and 1,000-pound high-explosive bombs, supplemented by incendiary bombs designed to ignite petroleum products. The bomb bay doors used a rolling design that retracted inside the fuselage rather than hanging down, significantly reducing drag when opened over the target. Defensive armament evolved throughout production. The B-24D mounted 10 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 2 in the nose, 2 in a dorsal turret behind the cockpit, 2 in a ventral ball turret, 2 at waist positions, and 2 in the tail turret. Each gun fired bullets half an inch in diameter, devastating against aircraft, but requiring thousands of rounds to reliably down enemy fighters. The aircraft carried crews of 10, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. For Operation Tidal Wave, mission planners made specific modifications to the 178 B-24 Sekunda assigned to the raid. Bomb bay fuel tanks were installed in all aircraft to extend range beyond 2,000 miles. Norden bomb sights, designed for high-altitude precision bombing, were replaced with low-level bomb sights, since the mission would be flown at wavetop height to avoid radar detection. Lead aircraft received 2 additional 50-caliber machine guns operated by the pilot for increased forward firepower during the attack run. Training for Ploesti had been exhaustive. Crews practiced for weeks over a full-scale mock-up of the target built in the Libyan desert. Each bomb group, squadron, and individual aircraft had specific assigned targets within the refinery complex. The planners understood that destroying a modern petroleum facility required hitting specific structures: boiler houses, cracking towers, distillation units, and power plants. Random bombing would accomplish little. The mission demanded precision that had never been attempted at such low altitude. 5 bomb groups participated: the 98th and 376th from the 9th Air Force, and the 44th, 93rd, and 389th from the 8th Air Force. Together they represented over 1,700 airmen flying into what everyone knew would be a heavily defended target. The Germans had been given advance warning by a smaller raid in June 1942. Colonel Gerstenberg had used that warning to build formidable defences, but he had planned for high-altitude attacks by smaller forces. The capability of 177 B-24 Sekunda to arrive simultaneously at low level, each carrying 4 tons of bombs after a 1,200-mile flight, exceeded every assumption his intelligence had provided. The formation reached the Romanian coast shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Captain Robert Sternfels, piloting the Sandman, descended to wavetop height as planned. The low-altitude approach was supposed to keep the bombers below German radar until the last possible moment. Behind him stretched nearly 180 B-24 Sekunda, arranged in precise waves that would hit 9 separate refinery targets in coordinated sequence. Then the sea mission began to unravel. Navigational errors in the lead aircraft sent portions of the formation off course. Radio silence, maintained for 1,200 miles, to preserve surprise, was broken as group leaders tried to redirect wayward squadrons. The Germans, monitoring radio frequencies, realized a major attack was imminent. Air raid sirens wailed across Ploesti at 1:30 in the afternoon. The element of surprise, critical to the entire plan, evaporated. Colonel Gerstenberg watched incoming reports with growing disbelief. His radar operators reported massive formations approaching at extremely low altitude. The numbers seemed impossible. Over 100 heavy bombers, not the 20 or 30 his intelligence had suggested, might attempt such a raid. As the first B-24 Sekunde appeared over the city at chimney height, Gerstenberg realized his defensive preparations, formidable as they were, had been designed for the wrong threat entirely. The 98th Bomb Group, led by Colonel John Kane, reached their target, the Astra Romana refinery complex, first. They flew through a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire, German 88mm flak guns, Romanian 37mm cannon, and hundreds of machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Barrage balloon cables sliced through the air at heights the Germans had never imagined bombers would fly. The steel cables could sever a B-24's aluminum wing in an instant. Lieutenant John McCormick, in Vagabond King, found himself flying at 225 miles per hour, through black smoke, flames, and exploding shells. His bombardier, Lieutenant Marvin Moscow, called bombs away, as McCormick steadied the aircraft over the refinery's cracking towers. 4,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary bombs fell into the industrial complex. The Vagabond jumped upward, suddenly 4,000 pounds lighter, as McCormick fought to maintain formation through the firestorm. German and Romanian defenders watched in shock as wave after wave of B-24 Sekunde pressed through the defences. Each bomber that was shot down and 54 would be destroyed over Ploesti was immediately replaced by another maintaining the attack. The weight of ordnance hitting the refineries exceeded anything Gerstenberg had prepared for. His defensive plan had assumed bombers arriving at high altitude after exhausting flights would deliver reduced payloads with degraded accuracy. Instead, aircraft arrived at full strength, flying at chimney height, dropping bombs with devastating precision. The Stoa Romana refinery, hit by the 98th Bomb Group, suffered catastrophic damage. Photographic reconnaissance 5 days later assessed, damage to this group of refineries is considerable. The crude oil distilling plant has been devastated by fires and explosions, while the cracking plant and stabilizer installation have been damaged severely. 9 storage tanks and at least 9 process tanks have been destroyed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the last B-24 Sekunde cleared Ploesti's defences. Behind them, 5 major refineries blazed with fires that would burn for days. Colonel Gerstenberg surveyed the damage with grim recognition. American bombers had just delivered over 500 tons of bombs onto targets over 1,200 miles from their bases. The operational capability this demonstrated shattered every assumption Luftwaffe intelligence had made about Allied strategic bombing potential. The return flight proved equally harrowing. 54 B-24 Sekunde had been shot down over the target. 3 more ditched in the Mediterranean. Others, badly damaged, limped to emergency landings in Turkey or Allied-controlled territory. Of the 177 aircraft that departed Benghazi that morning, only 88 returned to base. Most showed significant battle damage. The intelligence reports reaching Berlin in the days following Ploesti created immediate crisis within Luftwaffe command. The after-action analysis compiled by Colonel Gerstenberg's staff made uncomfortable reading for officers who had dismissed warnings about American bomber capabilities. The Americans had demonstrated operational range, payload capacity, and strike coordination that German doctrine had deemed impossible for heavy bombers. Reichsminister Albert Speer, responsible for armaments production, immediately grasped the strategic implications. In meetings with Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring during August 1943, Speer warned that if the Americans maintained pressure on ball-bearing factories and petroleum facilities, German armament production would collapse within 4 months. The Ploesti raid proved American bombers could reach any target in German-controlled Europe. Geography no longer provided protection. Luftwaffe intelligence officers scrambled to revise their assessments of Allied bomber capabilities. The B-24 Liberator, previously dismissed as a marginally improved Besiebsane, clearly represented a quantum leap in strategic bombing capacity. New intelligence estimates acknowledged that B-24 production in the United States exceeded 500 aircraft per month. A number German analysts had considered propaganda. Fort's Willow Run plant alone produced more heavy bombers monthly than Germany's entire aircraft industry produced of all types. The disparity in industrial capacity became impossible to ignore. Germany produced approximately 36,000 combat aircraft in 1944, an achievement that strained every resource. American aircraft production in the same year exceeded 96,000 planes, including over 8,000 B-24 Liberators. The Americans could afford to lose 54 bombers over Plosti and replace them within days. Germany, losing equivalent numbers of fighters defending against such raids, found replacement increasingly difficult as fuel shortages curtailed pilot training programs. Major Josef Schmid, whose intelligence assessments had consistently underestimated Allied capabilities, faced growing criticism from Luftwaffe operations staff. His optimistic reports about declining American bomber strength were contradicted by missions like Ploesti that demonstrated not declining capability but expanding reach and sophistication. Fighter units on the Eastern Front received orders to redeploy westward to defend German airspace. This reallocation weakened German air support for ground operations against Soviet forces, a strategic defeat enabled by American bombers. Schmid had assured commanders couldn't threaten the Reich's heartland. German fighter production, already inadequate to meet attrition rates, faced impossible demands. By late 1943, two-thirds of German fighter aircraft were committed to defending against Allied strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe had designed fighters for tactical air superiority over battlefields, not for intercepting massed formations of heavy bombers at 25,000 feet. New variants of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf F-190 received heavier armament 30mm cannon that could destroy a B-24 with 2 or 3 hits, but the increased weight degraded flight performance at precisely the moment when American P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang escort fighters were arriving over Germany in growing numbers. The realization that emerged from Plosti's rubble was strategic rather than tactical. The Luftwaffe could shoot down American bombers 54, destroyed over one target proved that, but the Americans could absorb such losses and return days later with equal or greater force. Germany could not sustain equivalent attrition rates in fighters and pilots while simultaneously supporting ground operations on multiple fronts. The mathematics of the air war had shifted decisively against the Reich. By September 1943, German flak batteries consumed 75% of all 88mm gun production weapons desperately needed as anti-tank guns on the Eastern Front, where Soviet armor superiority was becoming overwhelming. Over 1 million personnel operated anti-aircraft defenses across Germany and occupied territories. This represented manpower that could have reinforced frontline divisions facing Allied advances in Italy and Soviet offensives in the east. The B-24 Liberator had done more than bomb Ploesti. It had proven that American industrial might, married to advanced aeronautical engineering, could project destructive power across distances German planners had considered prohibitive. Every assumption underlying Luftwaffe defensive strategy required immediate revision. The strategic initiative in the air war had passed irrevocably to the Allies. The immediate aftermath of Operation Tidal Wave produced contradictory assessments that would take months to resolve. American commanders initially claimed devastating success. Photographic reconnaissance showed massive fires, destroyed facilities, and cratered refineries. 5 medals of honor were awarded for the mission, more than any other single air action of the war. 3 went to men who died pressing damaged aircraft toward their targets, rather than ordering their crews to bail out. But within weeks, disturbing intelligence reached Allied headquarters. German forced labor crews, working around the clock, had restored much of Ploesti's capacity faster than American planners thought possible. By October 1943, the refineries were producing more oil than before the raid. The mission that cost 310 American airmen their lives with another 108 captured and 78 interned in Turkey, had failed to achieve its strategic objective of crippling Axis fuel production. Yet this narrow tactical assessment missed the operation's profound strategic impact. Ploesti forced an immediate and permanent reallocation of German defensive resources. Within days of the raid, Luftwaffe fighter units received orders to abandon positions, supporting ground operations, and redeploy to defend petroleum facilities and industrial targets. The Eastern Front, where German armies were reeling from defeat at Kursk, lost air support precisely when it was most desperately needed. Colonel Gerstenberg received orders to expand Ploesti's defences massively. By December 1943, the refinery complexes bristled with over 200 anti-aircraft batteries, 88mm, 105mm, and 128mm guns pulled from frontline units facing Soviet armour. Each gun represented not just firepower diverted from critical theatres, but also crews, ammunition, and supply logistics that strained Germany's overtaxed transportation network. The B-24 crews who survived Ploesti returned to bases in North Africa and later Italy to face an intensifying campaign. The 15th Air Force, established in Italy in November 1943, would conduct another 19 major raids against Ploesti between April and August 1944. These attacks, flown at high altitude with fighter escort, methodically destroyed what the August 1st raid had only damaged. By August 1944, when Soviet forces captured the region, Ploesti's refineries were producing less than 10% of their pre-war capacity. The cumulative impact on German operations was catastrophic. Fuel shortages reached crisis levels by mid-1944. Luftwaffe training programs collapsed as aviation gasoline became too precious to waste on student pilots. Experienced fighter pilots received priority for increasingly scarce fuel, but even elite units found themselves grounded for days awaiting fuel shipments. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe's operational sortie rate had declined by 60%, not from aircraft shortages but from fuel unavailability. German panzer divisions faced similar constraints. The massive tank formations that had achieved stunning victories from 1939 through 1942 increasingly sat immobile, waiting for fuel that never arrived. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German commanders gambled on capturing American fuel depots because their own supply situation was so desperate. When this gamble failed, German armour offensive capability effectively ended. Captain Robert Sternfels survived the Ploesti raid, though his B-24, the Sandman, took extensive damage. He completed his combat tour and returned to the United States, haunted by memories of friends who hadn't made it back. In interviews decades later, Sternfels emphasized that Operation Tidal Wave's true success wasn't measured in destroyed refineries, but in forcing Germany to fight a defensive air war it could not win. The mission proved American bombers could reach any target in occupied Europe carrying full bomb loads, a demonstration that shattered German strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The lessons learned from Ploesti transformed Allied strategic bombing doctrine for the remainder of World War II. The raid's heavy losses, 30% of the attacking force, demonstrated that unescorted daylight bombing, even by heavily armed B-24 Sekunde, could not be sustained against determined defences. This realization accelerated development and deployment of long-range escort fighters that would prove decisive in the air war over Germany. The B-24 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, entered service in large numbers during late 1943 and early 1944. These fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a capability German intelligence had insisted was impossible for single-engine aircraft. The combination of B-24 Liberators and B-24 Mustangs, along with B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-47 Thunderbolts, gave the Allies an operational reach that rendered no German target safe from attack. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe faced an impossible situation. American 8th Air Force operations from England and 15th Air Force operations from Italy conducted coordinated raids that struck Germany from multiple directions simultaneously. The Luftwaffe had to defend everywhere while the Allies could concentrate overwhelming force wherever they chose to attack. Fighter pilot training, already degraded by fuel shortages, collapsed entirely as experienced instructors were pulled from training units to fill frontline squadrons, suffering unsustainable attrition. The numbers tell a stark story. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe possessed approximately 2,400 operational fighters defending German airspace. By June 1944 D-Day, that number had declined to fewer than 350 aircraft capable of opposing Allied operations, not because German factories couldn't build fighters. Production actually increased through 1944, but because pilot losses exceeded replacement rates and fuel shortages grounded available aircraft. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed fewer than 100 sorties over the beachheads during the critical first 24 hours. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties that same day. German soldiers, promised air support that never materialized, watched American and British aircraft dominate the skies with near impunity. General Dwight Eisenhower later wrote that achieving air superiority was the rock upon which we build all our plans. The B-24 Liberator played crucial roles beyond strategic bombing of Germany. In the Pacific theater, where distances dwarfed even European operations, the B-24's range proved invaluable. Navy WWII variants hunted Japanese submarines and attacked shipping across vast ocean expanses. In Burma and China, B-24 Secunda supplied Chinese forces and bombed Japanese positions across the Himalayas, missions impossible for shorter-range aircraft. The Battle of the Atlantic saw B-24 Liberators close the mid-Atlantic gap, where German U-boats had operated beyond the range of land-based aircraft. Modified with additional radar and depth charges, these maritime patrol variants could spend 3 hours on station 1,100 miles from base coverage that finally brought the submarine threat under control by mid-1943. Over 18,000 B-24 Liberators were produced by war's end, more than any other American combat aircraft. Ford's Willow Run plant alone manufactured 8,685 aircraft. This industrial achievement represented more than mere numbers. Each B-24, rolling off the assembly line every 51 minutes, demonstrated American manufacturing capacity that Germany simply could not match. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers who dismissed early reports of B-24 capabilities paid for their miscalculation with Germany's aerial defeat. By failing to accurately assess the threat, they gave Allied bomber forces time to establish operational procedures, develop tactics, and build overwhelming numerical superiority. When German planners finally acknowledged the reality of American bomber capabilities, the strategic air war was already lost. The B-24 Liberator never achieved the romantic mystique of the B-17 flying fortress. Crews found it harder to fly, less forgiving of mistakes, and more vulnerable to battle damage. But in the cold calculus of strategic warfare, the Liberator's superior range and payload capacity made it the more valuable weapon. The story of German intelligence failures regarding the B-24 Liberator reveals a deeper truth about how institutional blindness compounds military defeat. The Luftwaffe didn't simply underestimate one aircraft's capabilities. They created an entire system of assessment that rendered accurate intelligence impossible to deliver or accept. Major Josef Schmid, whose intelligence reports consistently painted Allied capabilities in the most favorable light for German leadership, exemplified the problem. His rise to prominence came not from analytical skill, but from political acumen, telling Hermann Göring what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. This pattern repeated throughout the Nazi command structure. Officers who delivered uncomfortable truths found themselves sidelined or reassigned. Those who provided optimistic assessments, however detached from reality, received promotions and influence. The organizational structure amplified these failures. Intelligence officers held low status within the Luftwaffe, their duties encompassing everything from troop welfare to propaganda, hardly the profile of a professional analytical service. Intelligence organizations existed only at the highest command levels, ensuring that frontline observations rarely reached decision-makers who might have corrected erroneous assumptions. When information did flow upward, it passed through multiple filters, each layer adjusting assessments to match expectations rather than evidence. This institutional dysfunction proved catastrophic when confronting an enemy like the United States. American advantages in industrial capacity, technological innovation, and resource availability were so overwhelming that acknowledging them fully would have required German leadership to admit the war was unwinnable. Rather than face this conclusion, intelligence officers produced reports that minimized American strengths and exaggerated German capabilities. The result was strategic planning based on comfortable fictions rather than uncomfortable facts. The B-24 Liberator exposed these fictions with brutal clarity. An aircraft that German doctrine said couldn't exist carrying 4-ton bomb loads. 1,700 miles appeared over Ploesti, in formations of nearly 200. The comfortable assumption that American engineering was inferior to German precision collapsed when confronted with the Davis Wing's performance. The belief that Allied industrial production figures were propaganda fell apart when Ford's assembly lines produced a complete bomber every hour. By the time Luftwaffe planners acknowledged reality, the window for effective response had closed. Fighter production increased, but fuel shortages prevented their use. Anti-aircraft batteries multiplied, but each gun represented resources desperately needed elsewhere. Pilot training improved on paper, but aviation gasoline shortages meant students flew fewer hours in progressively older, more worn-out aircraft. Every defensive measure came too late and cost too much. The human cost of these miscalculations extended far beyond military casualties. German cities, inadequately defended because resources had been allocated based on faulty intelligence, suffered devastating attacks. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died in fires that consumed Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin, cities that might have been better protected if Luftwaffe leadership had acknowledged Allied bomber capabilities earlier and allocated defensive resources accordingly. In the end, the story that began with Captain Robert Sternfels climbing into the Sandman on a Libyan airfield concludes with a larger lesson about the intersection of technology, intelligence, and strategic reality. The B-24 Liberator was simply an aircraft aluminum, steel, and engineering, but in the hands of a nation with vast industrial capacity and operational reach, it became a weapon that rendered German defensive strategy obsolete. The Luftwaffe never expected B-24 Sekunde to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs 1,700 miles, because accepting that capability meant acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Germany had challenged an enemy with resources and industrial might far beyond its capacity to defeat. The intelligence failure wasn't about one aircraft, it was about refusing to see what victory would actually require and what defeat would ultimately cost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.